The morning Elias Cutter got thrown out of his wife's family ranch, the sky was the color of a bruise. Not the kind that fades in a day or two, the kind that settles deep into bone, the kind that reminds a man every time he moves that something hit him hard and didn't let go. Purple at the edges, yellowing toward the center, with clouds stacked up over the Cimarron Ridge like they had nowhere else to be and no good intentions about staying. Elias stood on the porch of the Hargrove ranch with 2 carpet bags, a pair of 4-year-old twins clinging to his legs, and the particular expression of a man who has just been told, in plain language, that he is worth nothing. "You heard me," said Clifford Hargrove, patriarch of the Hargrove cattle empire, a man so wide across the shoulders that doorframes seemed to shrink when he walked through them. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, silver mustache bristling like a cornered porcupine. "Get off my land, Cutter. Take your brats and go." The word brats hit Elias somewhere below the ribs. He looked down at Rosie and Reed, Rosie with her mother's dark curls and her father's serious brown eyes, Reed with a smudge of breakfast biscuit still on his chin and his small fist balled up in Elias's trouser leg. They were 4 years old. They didn't fully understand the word brats yet. But they understood tone. And Clifford Hargrove's tone was the kind that even dogs flinched at. "Mr. Hargrove," Elias said, keeping his voice low. He kept his voice low not because he was afraid, though fear was certainly present, the way cold water is present in a deep well, but because of the children. "I understand you're grieving. We all are. Margaret was. Don't." The old man's jaw tightened. "Don't say her name. You don't get to say her name." Elias closed his mouth. Margaret Hargrove Cutter had died 6 weeks ago. Fever that came on fast, like summer storms in the territories, there one moment, catastrophic the next. She'd been healthy and laughing on a Tuesday, and by the following Wednesday she was in the ground behind the little whitewashed church in Perdition Creek, Texas, under a marble stone that her father had paid for and her husband had wept over until his throat was raw. She was 26 years old. She left behind a husband who had loved her genuinely and 2 small children who would grow up remembering her mostly from stories. She also left behind a family who had never thought much of the man she married. The Hargroves had ranching money. Not the kind of money that people in cities understood, not stocks and bonds and ledger books, but the kind of money that was measured in acres and head of cattle and how many men rode for your brand. Clifford Hargrove ran 60,000 acres of Texas grassland, employed 34 cowboys, and had a reputation that stretched from the Panhandle to the Gulf. His wife, Loretta Hargrove, was the kind of woman who wore silk on weekdays and made other women feel underdressed without saying a single word. And then there was their daughter Margaret, who had ridden into Perdition Creek on market day 4 years ago, seen Elias Cutter fixing a wagon wheel in front of the mercantile, sleeves rolled up, hair in his eyes, hands black with grease, and decided, in the impulsive and absolute way that some women decide things, that she was going to marry him. Her family had not agreed. "He's a nobody," Clifford had said. "A drifter. Man doesn't even own property." He was right, technically. Elias Cutter owned a mule, a good rifle, a worn Bible, and a set of tools. He'd grown up in the Oklahoma Territory, son of a preacher father who'd died young and a mother who'd worked laundry for other people's houses until her hands were red as clay. He had no land, no family name worth mentioning, no money to speak of. What he had was a steadiness about him, the kind that came from having survived things without becoming bitter about them, and a gentleness with animals and children and broken things that Margaret had noticed immediately and never stopped admiring. They were married in a small ceremony that the Hargroves attended with the expressions of people enduring a dental procedure. Then they moved into a 2-room house on the edge of town that Elias rented for $3 a month, and they had been, as far as Elias could measure happiness, happy. He'd worked. Lord, how he'd worked. Farrier work, wagon repair, odd jobs at the mill, a season driving cattle for a neighboring outfit. He'd never asked the Hargroves for a cent, never borrowed money, never showed up at their table looking for a handout. Margaret had brought a small inheritance from her grandmother, and they'd lived carefully on it, and Elias had slowly, dollar by dollar, been saving toward a piece of land of his own. Then Margaret died. And the grief cracked something open in Clifford Hargrove, not the kind of crack that lets light in, but the kind that lets the cold through. He'd never liked Elias. Had never forgiven his daughter for choosing a poor man. And now that Margaret was gone, the restraint she'd provided, the buffer between her husband and her family, was gone too. So here they were. "You'll leave the children," Loretta Hargrove said. She appeared in the doorway behind her husband, hands clasped in front of her, face arranged into something that was technically composed but held no warmth. "They're Hargroves. They stay here." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. Just that one word. Not angry. Not loud. Just, no. The way a stone wall says no to a river. It doesn't rage. It just doesn't move. Loretta's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Cutter. You can barely feed yourself, let alone 2 children. We can provide for them. Schools, clothes, a future. What can you offer them? A rented room and a farrier's wages?" "I can offer them their father," Elias said. "That's what I can offer them. Their father is a nobody from nowhere who married above himself and has nothing to show for it," Clifford said, and his voice had gone very quiet now, the way dangerous things sometimes went quiet. "My daughter is dead. You are all that is left of her mistake. I will not have those children raised in poverty by a man who was never good enough for their mother. You leave them, or I'll have my lawyer see to it that." "You'll what?" Elias said. And something in his tone, quiet, certain, carrying the specific quality of a man who has calculated every step of a conversation before having it, made Clifford pause. "I've looked into it," Elias continued, picking up one carpet bag, then the other. "Margaret and I were lawfully married. These children are mine under Texas law. You have no legal claim on them. If your lawyer disagrees, I'd encourage him to read more carefully." He looked down at Rosie and Reed. "Come on, sweetheart. Come on, bud." Rosie immediately reached up and took his hand. Reed took a moment, because Reed always took a moment to assess a situation before committing to it. He was, even at 4 years old, constitutionally deliberate, and then he reached up and took his father's other hand. Elias walked down the porch steps with his children on either side of him and his bags over his shoulders and didn't look back. Behind him, Clifford Hargrove said, "You'll regret this, Cutter. You'll come crawling back when you've got nothing left." Elias kept walking. Perdition Creek, Texas was not a big town, but it was the kind of town that had everything a man needed if his needs were modest. There was a general store, a church, a school, a saloon that also functioned as the post office in a loose and informal way, a livery, and a scattering of houses and businesses that clung to the 2 main streets like barnacles on a pier. There was also, on the northern edge of town, a boarding house run by a widow named Eunice Pratt, who was 70 years old, built like a fence post, and possessed of an absolute inability to turn away people who needed a roof. Elias had done farrier work for her late husband once, years ago. He appeared at her door that afternoon with 2 children, 2 bags, and the look of a man who had run out of comfortable options. Eunice looked at him. Looked at the children. Looked at him again. 2 rooms or 1, she asked. "I can only afford 1, he said honestly. 1 it is. $3 a week, includes breakfast. Children eat free. Don't track mud past the entryway." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mr. Cutter?" She held the door open. "I'm sorry about Margaret. She was a good woman." Elias's throat tightened. "She was," he agreed. "The best I knew." They settled into the one room, which had a big bed and a narrow cot and a window that looked out over the scrub brush to the west. Elias put the children in the bed and took the cot. He unpacked their things into the single dresser, their clothes, the twins' small toys, the worn Bible, and at the very bottom of his bag, wrapped in a piece of cloth, a photograph of Margaret. He set it on the dresser where the children could see it. "Where's Mama?" Rosie asked that night. She asked this question regularly, with the persistence of someone who believed that eventually the answer would change. "Heaven," Elias said. "Same answer as always." "Does heaven have horses?" "I expect so." "Mama liked horses." "She did," Elias said. "She was good with them too. Fearless." Reed, from his side of the bed, said nothing. He had not been saying much since his mother died. The doctor in town, who doubled as the area's only person with any medical training, had told Elias that some children went quiet after a loss and that it usually passed. Elias watched his son and worried the way fathers worry, silently, at night, staring at the ceiling. He reached over and put his hand on Reed's small back, and after a moment the boy's breathing slowed into sleep. Work was the only cure Elias knew for helplessness, so he worked. Perdition Creek had a farrier, old Jefferson Cole, who was 63 and whose hands shook on cold mornings, but the town was growing, and there was enough horse business for 2 men, and Jefferson was glad enough for the help that he didn't make trouble about sharing the trade. Elias was good with horses in the way that can't entirely be taught, patient, observant, with a way of moving around them that communicated no threat. Horses liked him. He could gentle a spooked animal faster than most men could rope one. He took whatever work came beside that. Fixed a wagon for the mercantile owner. Patched a roof for the preacher. Chopped wood for Eunice, who took it off his rent without making a production of the charity involved. Money was tight, tighter than tight, some weeks, the particular tightness that makes a man count coins on the table in the evening and do the arithmetic 3 times hoping the number will change. He kept the children fed. He kept them clothed. He walked them to school in the mornings and was there in the afternoons when school let out, reliable as a clock, so that they always came out of the schoolhouse doors and immediately found their father's face in the small crowd of waiting parents. He did not go to the saloon. He did not spend money on anything that wasn't necessary. He did not feel sorry for himself, at least not where anyone could see it. At night, when the children were asleep, he allowed himself 15 minutes of feeling the full weight of everything, the grief for Margaret, the humiliation of the Hargroves, the fear about the future, the particular ache of being alone in the raising of 2 small people who deserved everything and might get considerably less. 15 minutes, and then he put it away, because tomorrow required him functional. The letter arrived on a Thursday in October, 6 months after Margaret died. Elias was in Jefferson Cole's smithy, fitting shoes on a rancher's quarter horse, when the postmaster's boy appeared in the doorway, Hector Munoz, 12 years old, reliable as gravity, and held out an envelope. "Mr. Cutter. This came for you." Official looking. Elias straightened up, wiped his hands on his leather apron, and took the envelope. It was indeed official looking. Heavy paper, cream-colored, with a return address in Austin, Texas, the offices of Whitmore, Aldridge and Sons, attorneys at law. His name was written on the front in the careful, upright penmanship of someone paid to have good handwriting. He opened it. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he stood in the doorway of Jefferson Cole's smithy holding the letter and staring at the horizon for a length of time that caused the quarter horse to turn its head and look at him curiously. "Bad news?" Jefferson called from inside. Elias looked at the letter. "I don't know yet," he said. The letter was from a firm in Austin he'd never heard of, representing the estate of one Augustus Silas Cutter, lately of Behar County, Texas. The letter informed Elias Mason Cutter that he had been named sole heir to said estate, which the attorneys described with careful legal language that Elias had to read 3 times before the number resolved itself into something his mind could hold. $211,000 in cash accounts. Several thousand acres of land in the hill country. A house. Mineral rights on a portion of the property that had recently been found to be considerable. Various personal property. Total estimated value, somewhere north of $200 million, in a combination of liquid assets and property, once the mineral rights were properly assessed. The name Augustus Silas Cutter meant nothing to Elias. He had been told, as a child, that his father had no family, that Elias's grandfather had died before his father was born, that there were no aunts, uncles, cousins, nothing. His father had been a solitary man, a preacher moving from one small congregation to the next, and had died when Elias was 9 years old without leaving anything behind except the worn Bible on Elias's dresser and the instruction to be honest and to be kind. Elias had followed both instructions as well as he could. And apparently, somewhere in the branching and lost genealogy of the Cutter family, there had been a great-uncle, Augustus Silas Cutter, cattle baron and land speculator and owner of oil-adjacent property, who had been looking for his brother's descendants for 30 years, and who had died 6 weeks ago at the age of 87, having finally located Elias through a succession of family records and a persistent investigator, and had left everything he owned to the only blood he had left in the world. Elias sat down on a fence post outside the smithy. He sat there for a long time. A brown dog came over and sat next to him companionably. "Well," Elias said to the dog. The dog offered no particular wisdom, but it pressed its side against Elias's leg, which he found helpful. He hired a horse from the livery and rode to Austin the following week, leaving the children with Eunice Pratt, who told him not to worry and meant it. He spent 3 days with the attorneys, serious men in a serious office with a great deal of paper and the careful manner of people accustomed to delivering life-altering information to people who were not prepared to receive it. It was all real. Entirely, documentably, legally real. Augustus Silas Cutter had built his fortune over 50 years of Texas cattle and land, had watched the oil prospectors arrive with interest, had secured mineral rights on his hill country property at a moment when everyone thought he was being eccentric, and had died very rich and very alone. He'd been married twice, both wives had predeceased him. He had no children. He had spent the last decade of his life in a systematic effort to find his brother's son's son, Elias, and had found him just barely in time. The investigators had located Elias's address in Perdition Creek 2 months before Augustus died. Augustus had instructed the attorneys to wait until a proper accounting was done before making contact, and so the letter arrived 6 weeks after the old man's death, finding Elias in Jefferson Cole's smithy with horseshoe nails in his apron pocket and less than $40 to his name. "There's a considerable irony in the timing, I understand," the senior attorney, a white-haired man named Theodore Whitmore, said carefully. "Yes, sir," Elias agreed. "There is." He signed the papers. He was taken to the bank, where the initial transfer of cash assets was explained to him. He visited the hill country property, rolling limestone land, cedar and live oak, a creek running cold and clear through the middle of it, and a house that was larger than anything Elias had ever lived in or expected to live in, solid and stone-built and looking out over a view that made a man feel small in the best possible way. He stood on the porch of that house and thought about his children. About the boarding house room. About the carpet bags on the Hargrove porch. About Clifford Hargrove's voice saying "You're brats" and their mother's mistake and you'll come crawling back when you've got nothing left. Elias Cutter was not a man given to dramatic emotions. He was not the kind of man who crowed about things or nursed vindication like a wound. But standing on that porch, he felt something loosen in his chest, some long-held tightness, some piece of himself that had been braced against the world for so long it had started to feel normal. He was not nobody. He had never been nobody. He just hadn't known it. He rode back to Perdition Creek on a Saturday. Eunice Pratt had the children fed and clean and mildly muddy around the boots, the way children always found some mud regardless of conditions. Rosie ran at him from across the yard with her arms wide open, and he caught her and swung her up, and Reed followed at his more measured pace and attached himself to his father's leg. "You were gone a long time," Rosie announced. "For days," Elias said. "That's a very long time." "It is. I'm sorry. Did you bring anything?" "Rosie," he said, mock seriously, "is that all I am to you? A delivery service?" She considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old philosopher. No, she decided. But it would be nice. He had, in fact, brought them each a small something from Austin, a cloth doll for Rosie, a set of wooden building blocks for Reed that were better quality than anything they'd had before. He'd also bought himself a new shirt, which was the first new shirt he'd bought in 2 years, and even that had felt faintly reckless. He'd told no one where he'd been or why. He was not entirely sure why he was being careful about this. Instinct, perhaps. The habit of a man who had learned that good news said too soon to the wrong people had a way of curdling. He spent the next 3 weeks quietly, methodically, getting his affairs in order. He met with Theodore Whitmore twice more, including once when the attorney rode out to Perdition Creek specifically, which caused a certain amount of speculation in town that Elias did nothing to address. He arranged the transfer of legal title to the Hill Country property, set up the bank accounts, began corresponding with the land manager who had been running the ranch operations under instruction from the estate. He told Jefferson Cole that he'd be leaving the farrier work, and Jefferson shook his hand and said he'd known from the beginning that Elias was too good at the job to stay in a small town forever, which was a gracious way of putting it. He told Eunice Pratt. She was the first person he told, because she had earned it. He told her in her kitchen on a Wednesday morning, the children at school, and she listened with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her expression unchanging until he finished. Then she was quiet for a moment. "Augustus Cutter," she said finally. "I heard that name once. Cattle King, Hill Country. Big man. Apparently he was my father's uncle. I didn't know. And you're sure it's real?" "Yes, ma'am. Attorneys, banks, deeds, the whole thing. It's real." Eunice looked at him steadily. "And what are you going to do?" "Move to the property with the children. Get them settled. Figure out what comes next." He paused. "I'd like to offer you something, Eunice. For what you've done for us. Money, or, if you'd ever want to retire somewhere more comfortable, I have." "Keep your money," she said, not unkindly. "I've got what I need, and I don't know what I'd do with more. What I'd accept is a letter now and then, and maybe a visit from those children at Christmas." "That you'll have," he said. "Without question." She reached across the table and patted his hand once, brisk, practical, the way she did everything. "Good. Now drink your coffee before it goes cold. Rich men waste coffee just like poor ones." He went to see the Hargroves on a Tuesday. He had not planned to go immediately. He had planned to settle the children first, to get the move organized, to not let anything impulsive drive him to do something he'd regret. He had those plans clearly in mind. But then he was riding past the turn toward the Hargrove ranch on his way back from the land office, and he turned the horse. It was a 15-minute ride to the Hargrove main house from the road, long enough for him to reconsider twice and keep riding anyway. He'd borrowed a better horse from the livery for the trip to Austin and liked it well enough that he'd bought it. The horse was a bay gelding, sound and well-made, and he moved easily on the good road. The Hargrove ranch appeared as it always did, imposing, purposeful, built to communicate wealth and permanence. The main house was white-painted wood, 2 stories, with a wide porch running around 3 sides. There were cowboys visible in the yard and at the corrals, and the whole operation had the particular organized bustle of a prosperous cattle outfit in the fall. Elias rode to the front of the house and dismounted. A Hargrove hand named Dooley, who Elias knew slightly, came to take the horse. Dooley looked at him with the expression of a man who remembered the last time Elias had been here and was uncertain what the current visit portended. "Is Mr. Hargrove in?" Elias asked. "Yes, sir." You want me to let him know you're here?" "Please." He waited on the front path. He didn't go to the porch. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, which was partly politeness and partly so that he had something to do with his hands. Clifford Hargrove appeared in the doorway after a few minutes. He was in shirt sleeves, which meant Elias had caught him in the middle of the working day, and he had the expression of a man who had been interrupted and was not glad of it, and who was additionally not glad of who had done the interrupting. "Cutter," he said flatly. "Mr. Hargrove." Clifford came out onto the porch. He did not invite Elias up. "What do you want?" I wanted to let you know that the children and I are leaving Perdition Creek, Elias said. Relocating to the hill country. I thought you should know, in case you wanted to say goodbye to them before we go. Something crossed Clifford's face. It might have been guilt, though on Clifford Hargrove's face it was hard to distinguish guilt from indigestion. Leaving, he said. Where are you getting the money for that? Elias looked at him steadily. I've come into an inheritance, he said. My father's uncle passed recently and left me his estate. Clifford stared at him. What estate? Augustus Silas Cutter's estate, Elias said. The hill country property and various associated holdings. The silence that followed was significant. Even from the porch steps, Elias could see the moment the name registered. Clifford Hargrove had been in Texas cattle long enough that Augustus Cutter's name was not unfamiliar to him. Clifford started. He stopped. His sole heir, yes sir. Elias kept his voice level. The property runs to a few thousand acres of good land, plus mineral rights that are proving more valuable than expected. The attorneys are still working through the full accounting. Another silence. Loretta Hargrove appeared in the doorway behind her husband, drawn by the quiet in a way that suggested she'd been listening from inside. She looked at Elias. Her expression was hard to read. The children are healthy, Elias said, addressing them both. They're doing well in school. Reed is talking more. He went quiet for a while after Margaret died, but he's coming back to himself. He paused. They know who their mother was. I make sure of that. I'll keep making sure of that. Clifford's jaw worked. He was a man accustomed to holding the high ground in every conversation, and he was not accustomed to the feeling of having it quietly shifted away without anyone raising their voice. You could have stayed, Loretta said finally, and her voice was different than it had been 6 months ago, something in it that might, if you were being charitable, be called uncertain. We would have provided for them. They don't need providing for, ma'am, Elias said. They have me. He looked at Clifford. You said I'd come crawling back, he said. I didn't. And I won't. I'm telling you where we're going because Margaret would have wanted her children to know their grandparents, and because those children are innocent of whatever you think about their father, and so the door will be open on my end if you choose to walk through it properly. He settled his hat back on his head. But I won't be crawled at, and I won't be talked to the way you talked to me on that porch, and if that's the only way you know how to treat people then you'll get to know your grandchildren through the stories they tell about their mother, and nothing else. He turned and took his horse's reins from Dooley, who had been standing at a tactful distance with the expression of a man who has witnessed something and would be dining out on it for years. Good day, Mr. Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove. He rode out. Behind him, he heard nothing. No call to wait, no response, no sound at all. Just the wind in the grass and the distant sound of cattle and the creak of the porch as one of them shifted their weight. The move to the hill country took 3 weeks to organize. There were arrangements to be made, furniture to be ordered, staff to be considered. The ranch already had a manager, a capable man named Hector Vega who had been running the day-to-day operations under the estate's instruction and whom Elias retained immediately, because competent people are not to be released without excellent reason. There were decisions about livestock, about which of the existing hands to keep, about what repairs the house needed and what could wait. Elias approached all of it the way he'd approached everything else in his life, methodically, without pretension, listening more than he talked. He was out of his depth and he knew it. A man who had been counting pennies 6 months ago was not automatically qualified to manage a large ranch and significant financial holdings just because those things were now legally his. He hired good people to advise him. He asked questions that some men in his position might have been too proud to ask. He read, constantly, about cattle, about land management, about the business structures the estate already had in place. And he talked to Hector Vega, who turned out to be a remarkably patient man with a gift for explaining complex operations simply. Hector was 45, had been managing the Augustus Cutter Ranch for 12 years, and had more practical knowledge about the land and the cattle and the mineral rights and the water and the legal arrangements with neighboring properties than any attorney in Austin. He was also, once he understood that Elias was not going to be a difficult or unreasonable employer, quietly pleased about the inheritance. Augustus had been a fair man but an old one, and the property had needed a younger presence for some years. "Your uncle," Hector said one afternoon, standing at the fence of the main corral and looking out over the herd, "he used to say the land had more patience than people. That it would wait." He paused. "I think maybe it waited for you." Elias looked out at the land, the rolling limestone hills, the live oaks casting dappled shade, the creek glinting silver in the distance. "It's something," he said, because he still didn't have adequate words for what it was. "Takes time to feel like home," Hector said. "Particularly if you didn't expect it." "I didn't expect any of this." "No," Hector agreed. "But you seem like a man who'll figure it out." The children adapted to the new house with the philosophical flexibility of the very young. Reed, who had been the quieter one, the one who assessed everything before committing, seemed to expand in the space, literally and metaphorically. The hill country land was different from the flat Texas plain he'd spent his first years on. It had more texture to it, more things to investigate, more corners and crannies and limestone outcroppings and cedar stands to explore. Elias watched his son spend an entire afternoon crouched over a section of creek bank, studying something in the water with total absorption, and thought about how some people needed room to become themselves. Rosie took to the house as if she'd been waiting for it. She had opinions about which room should be hers, opinions about the color of the curtains, opinions about where things should go and which pieces of furniture were acceptable and which were not. The housekeeper Elias hired, a capable woman named Señora Herrera, who had worked for the estate previously and agreed to stay, regarded Rosie with a combination of exasperation and approval that suggested she recognized a kindred spirit. "That one," Señora Herrera told Elias after the first week, "is going to be someone when she grows up." "She's already someone," Elias said. Señora Herrera looked at him with the expression of a woman deciding whether a man was simple or profound, and apparently decided in favor of profoundness, because she nodded and went back to her kitchen. They settled. Slowly, imperfectly, with the ordinary chaos of children and new routines and learning where things were and who was who on the ranch, they settled. Elias found a tutor for the children in the nearest town, a serious young man from the east who was a little startled by Texas but willing to be good at his job. He kept his own hours careful and his money careful and his mind careful, because old habits of carefulness are not easily shed and he wasn't sure they should be. He thought about Margaret every day. He didn't stop thinking about her, he didn't expect to. She would have loved this land, he thought. She would have been out on a horse every morning before breakfast, covering ground, seeing everything. She would have had ideas about the house and the garden and the management of things, and she would have argued with Hector Vega about cattle in the particular cheerful way she argued with people she respected, and she would have been, he thought, happy here. He kept her photograph on his dresser. A new dresser now, in a larger room, with a better view. But the same photograph. The letter from the Hargroves arrived in December. It was from Loretta, not Clifford. 2 pages, written in the careful formal hand of a woman who was not comfortable with informality even in private correspondence, saying things that the formal language barely contained. She said she hoped the children were well. She said she hoped the property was suiting them. She said, and here the formal language strained somewhat visibly, that she had perhaps been unkind in October, when Elias had come to the ranch. She said that she had spoken to her husband, and that Clifford was not well. His heart, the doctor had told them, was not strong, and the winter was not agreeing with him, and that perhaps, if Elias was willing, they might find a way to let the children know their grandparents. She did not apologize, quite. She got very close to it, in the way that some people get close to things without being able to make the final step. Elias read the letter in his study. He had a study now, a room with bookshelves and a desk and a window looking south, and he sat with it for a while. He thought about what Margaret would say. He thought he knew. He wrote back. He kept it brief. He said the children were well and growing and asked after their health. He said he was glad Loretta had written. He said that the children would be glad to know their grandparents if their grandparents wished to know them, and that he had meant what he'd said on the ranch road in October, the door was open, and it would stay open, for the children's sake, and that he held no resentment toward them that he would let fall on the children's heads. He signed it Elias Cutter and sent it. Clifford Hargrove rode out to the hill country in January. He came alone, which surprised Elias. He arrived in the late morning on a gray winter day when the cedar smelled sharp and the creek was running high, and he sat on his horse in front of the house for a moment before dismounting as if he were having a conversation with himself that needed to finish before he got off. Elias came out to meet him. Clifford Hargrove looked older than he had in October. Whatever the winter and the doctor's verdict had done to him had taken something from the porcupine bristle quality that had always characterized him. He still stood straight. He was still a large man. But something around his eyes had softened, not pleasantly but honestly, the way faces soften when a man has been genuinely frightened. They stood in the yard and looked at each other. "The property is well situated," Clifford said finally, looking around. "It is," Elias agreed. "Good land." "Yes, sir." A pause. "My daughter," Clifford started, and then stopped. He pressed his mouth together. "Tried again. Margaret knew things about people that I didn't. She always did. Her whole life." He stopped again. He was clearly not a man accustomed to saying the kind of thing he was trying to say. "She chose you." "She did," Elias said. "I didn't trust her judgment," Clifford said. "I should have." It was not a full apology. It was, perhaps, as much of one as Clifford Hargrove was able to produce, and Elias, who had spent enough time reading people, recognized it for what it was. "You'll want to see the children," he said. Clifford Hargrove, cattle baron, patriarch of 60,000 acres, looked at him with something raw and unguarded in his expression. "Yes," he said. "If you'll allow it." "I said the door was open," Elias said. "Come inside." Reed came first, because Reed always assessed a situation before committing to it, and the assessment this time took approximately 30 seconds before he decided that the large old man sitting carefully in the parlor chair was probably not a threat. He went and stood in front of Clifford and regarded him with the disconcerting direct gaze that he'd inherited from both parents. "Are you our grandfather?" Reed asked. Clifford's throat worked. "I am," he said. "Mama talked about you," Reed said. "She said you were stubborn but you were fair when it counted." Something passed across Clifford's face. "She said that?" "I remember," Reed said with the simple authority of a child who does not yet understand that memories fade. Rosie arrived at a run, skidded to a stop, looked at the old man, and said, "Are you really very rich?" "Papa says we're not supposed to ask that question but I want to know." Clifford Hargrove made a sound that was, improbably, a laugh. "Rosie," Elias said. "What?" "It's a reasonable question." "I used to be," Clifford told her gravely, "the richest man in 3 counties. Rosie thought about this. "Papa's richer now," she said, with the loyalty and the complete tactlessness of a 4-year-old. Clifford looked at Elias over the children's heads. And there was something in his expression, complicated, rueful, with the specific quality of a man who has been outmaneuvered by the universe and has decided to find it, ultimately, acceptable. "Yes," he said. "I suppose he is." The months that followed had the quality of things finding their level, the way water finds its level in a vessel. Clifford Hargrove rode out to the hill country property twice more that winter, and in the spring he and Loretta came together and stayed for a week. It was not without friction. Clifford was constitutionally incapable of being in a place without wanting to assess how it was run and offer opinions on any inefficiencies he detected, and Hector Vega had opinions of his own that were not always compatible with Clifford's, and there were 2 or 3 evenings where the conversation at dinner had the careful quality of a chess match played by polite people who were not entirely sure they liked each other. But the children loved it. Rosie, who had her mother's instinct for emotional cartography, navigated the complicated weather between the adults with the same ease she navigated everything else. Reed, who had been quiet for so long after Margaret's death, sat next to Clifford in the evenings and listened with great attention while the old man talked about cattle and land and the early days of Texas ranching, which Reed absorbed with the systematic thoroughness of someone building a very detailed internal library. One evening Elias found them in the study, Clifford in the big chair by the fire, Reed on the footstool beside him, and Clifford showing Reed something in an old ledger book, some record from the early days of the Hargrove ranch, talking about head counts and water rights and the drought year of 1860-something in the matter-of-fact way that old men talk to children who are actually listening. Elias stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. He was not a man who believed that things worked out, exactly. He had seen too much of the world's indifference to hold that faith uncritically. But he believed in people, in the specific and complicated truth of people, their capacity for both the worst and the better, their ability to arrive, eventually, at something more honest than they started with. He went back down the hall and let them be. In the spring, when the hill country bloomed in the particular extravagant way it bloomed, bluebonnets in the pastures, the creek banks running with wildflowers, the live oaks putting out their new pale leaves, Elias walked the fence line of the south pasture with Hector Vega and they talked about the coming year. The mineral rights were producing. Not enormously, the assessment was still ongoing, but sufficiently, and the ranch itself was sound, and there was talk of expanding the herd if the summer rains cooperated. "Your uncle would be pleased," Hector said. "I hope so," Elias said. "I still feel like I didn't earn it." "Not everything is earned," Hector said. "Some things are just given. The question is what you do with them." Elias looked out at the south pasture, at the cattle moving slowly through the grass, at the hills rolling away to the horizon under a sky so blue it looked like something from a painting. He thought about a porch in October and 2 carpet bags and 2 children holding his hands. He thought about 15 minutes at night when he allowed himself to feel the weight of things. He thought about Margaret, always about Margaret, and what she had seen in him when she looked at him fixing a wagon wheel in front of a mercantile, and whether what she had seen had been the person he was or the person he was going to be. He supposed those might be the same thing. "I'm working on it," he said. Hector nodded, as if this were the correct answer. "That's all any man can do," he said, and they turned and walked back toward the house, where 2 children who were 5 years old now and growing faster than Elias could entirely keep track of were somewhere on the property making whatever trouble 5-year-olds make when they've got 1,000 acres to make it in. The last piece of business with the Hargroves came from Clifford, in a letter in the summer. He was not well, his heart was worsening, and the doctor had told him things that a man of 68 does not enjoy being told, and he had been doing the kind of accounting that sick men do, not of finances but of decisions. The letter was 3 pages, which was more than Clifford Hargrove had probably written to anyone in 20 years, and it said, in the formal and effortful way of a man who has decided that some things need to be said before they can't be, that he had been wrong about Elias. That he had measured a man by the wrong things, by money and land and family name, by the things that could be assessed from outside, and had missed entirely the things that could not. That Margaret had known better than he had, and that the evidence of the past year, the children, the way they were being raised, the way Elias had conducted himself through something that would have broken a lesser man or a worse one, was the evidence of someone who had, in fact, always been worth something. That he was sorry. Just that, plainly, without the hedging and the perhaps and the formal language of the earlier letter. "I am sorry, Elias. I was wrong and I am sorry." Elias read it in the study on a summer morning with the window open and the smell of the hill country coming through on the warm air. He thought about what it costs a proud man to say that. He thought about the size of that cost, and about the fact that Clifford Hargrove had paid it, and what that meant. He wrote back the same day. He said, without ceremony or excess, "The debt is forgiven. Come in the fall if you're well enough. The children will want to see you, and so will I." He meant it. Entirely. That was the other thing about Elias Cutter, the thing that Margaret had seen first, and that the Hargroves had eventually understood, and that his children would know their whole lives without ever having to be told it directly. He did not carry malice. Not because he was naive, and not because he had not been hurt, but because he had looked at malice and decided it was too heavy to carry on a long road. The road was long. He had children to walk it with. And 1,000 acres of hill country land under a blue Texas sky. He put the letter in the drawer, closed his study, and went out to find his kids. He found them by the creek. Reed was in the water up to his ankles, which he was not supposed to be, examining something in the limestone under the surface with the total focus he brought to everything that interested him. Rosie was on the bank, directing operations from a safe and dry position, because Rosie had the instincts of a general even at 5 years old. "You're not supposed to be in the water," Elias said. "I'm studying," Reed said, without looking up. "Studying what?" "There are crawdads under this rock. I'm counting them." "How many so far?" 11. Possibly 12. One keeps moving. Elias sat down on the bank next to Rosie, who immediately leaned against him in the comfortable way she had. "Papa," she said. "When I grow up, can I have a ranch too?" "You can have whatever you work for," he said. She considered this. "I'm going to work for a very big one." "Then you'll have a very big one." "Bigger than this?" "If that's what you want." She thought about it a moment more. "Maybe just this big," she decided. "This one is pretty good." Reed, from the water, said, 12. "Definitely 12. The creek ran cold and clear over the limestone. The live oaks moved in the warm air. Above the ridge, the Texas sky was doing what Texas sky did best, vast and unreasonable and absolutely beautiful, going on and on without apology. Elias Cutter, inheritor of $200 million worth of land and cattle and mineral rights, sat on a creek bank in the hill country with his 5-year-old daughter leaning on him and his 5-year-old son counting crawdads in the water, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because of the money. The money was useful. The money was security, which was not a small thing when you had spent years counting pennies at night. But it was not the thing. The thing was this creek, these children, this land, this sky. The photograph on his dresser and the worn Bible and the 15 minutes at night that he no longer needed quite so much. The door he'd left open and the letter in the drawer. The long road that had turned out to lead here. He'd never been nobody. He just hadn't known it yet. He knew it now.